10. "Have you known Evie long?" Cass asked, as he and Matcha stood on either side of the main doors, like guards waiting for royalty. She gave him a quick smile. "Only a few years. Ever since we began taking care of Mr. Diazal. Most days he's docile, but others—" "What's wrong with him?" Cass leaned up against the wall on the far side of the door. "We're not sure. The doctors can't figure it out, but there's something tearing at his brain, pulling it apart piece by piece, and slowly driving him mad. We try to make him as comfortable as we can, give him everything he needs, but he deteriorates a little every day. This last week has been the worst. I can't tell you what good timing it is the commander showed up when she did. I wasn't sure he was going to make it when we last talked. Your ship was a lot further out." "Yeah, we found a shortcut." Cass glanced over at the paintings along the wall. "Seems like his aptitude for painting is going strong." "Ironically, he's been doing some of his best work in this past year. It's like the longer he's been here, the better—" Matcha snapped her gaze down to the comm unit embedded in the back of her hand. It flashed a bright red under the skin, and her face shifted into one of concern. She ran to the antechamber door, opening it for both of them. "What is it?" Cass asked. She pushed past him and entered a sequence in the door to the right, and it slid open to reveal Evie being held on the floor by what looked like a frail old man. His face was within centimeters of her own. "Mr. Diazal!" Matcha yelled, running over to him and grabbing him under the armpits. "That is your daughter! Get off her!" Diazal only snarled and knocked her back. Cass didn't know how he had the strength to do it, but he returned his gaze to Evie, who struggled under his grasp. Cass bent down and shoved all his weight into the old man, and knocking him off her, sending him and Cass sprawling to the ground. Cass had just a second to appreciate the beautiful view out the window before Diazal flailed under him, trying to reach up and scratch his face. He heard Matcha yell something into her comm before she ran over and helped get him under control. Cass couldn't see Evie. He only hoped she was okay. Mr. Diazal, stop, she yelled, grabbing his hands and pinning them down. Cass managed to get the man's legs under him so they'd stop kicking. Out of his peripheral vision, he saw Evie come into view. With a look of disgust, she wiped her face, leaned down to the old man, and slapped him across the cheek, hard. She reached up to do it again, when 3 other large men burst into the room, all wearing a variation of Matcha's uniform. They ordered everyone back and took over for Cass and Matcha as they wrangled Diazal under their control. "Commander, are you okay?" Matcha asked, as they restrained Osborne with electronic cuffs on both his hands and feet. Evie looked shaken, to say the least. Her face was pale, and she drew deep breaths like she might hyperventilate. Cass reached up to touch her shoulder, and she recoiled from him, giving him a death glare. She shook out her hands and wiped her face again, watching the men get Diazal on his feet and take him into a different room. "Nothing but a goddamn mistake," he yelled. "Not even supposed to be here." The doors closed behind him, cutting off his ranting. "Commander, I am so sorry," Matcha said. "I never should have let you in here with him alone." Evie clenched and unclenched her fists, walking around the room in no discernible pattern. What in the hell had he been trying to do? Assault her? His own daughter? That man needed to be locked up for what little life he had left. Cass hadn't realized her father was so old. He must have been in his 50s when Evie was born. "It's not your fault." Evie rolled her shoulders and shook her head, like she was trying to cleanse herself of something disgusting. And Cass couldn't blame her. "What is he on?" "Excuse me?" Matcha asked. "What sort of stimulants? Drugs?" She stopped walking for a moment, watching Matcha. "He's on Mirzapram for his anxiety, but it's a depressant." She glanced to the closed door. "Clearly the dose is too low." Evie shook her head. "No, he's on something else. I should have been able to easily throw him off. He's got to be on an enhancement. Maybe something someone here is slipping him." "I'll do a complete workup and get you the results immediately," Matcha said. "Don't bother." Evie turned to the open balcony, her fists still doing their dance. I'm done with that man. But you need to know you have a security leak here, and you need to take care of it. Her voice was flustered, and when she turned back, some of the color had returned to her face. Cass could only assume she was using her anger to override her fear or anything else she might be feeling. You don't want us to keep you updated? Macha asked. The man I knew is dead, if he was even really there to begin with, Evie said. Coming here was a mistake. It's what I get for trying to repair a relationship that is long past the point of no return. She furrowed her brow. Figure out what's going on with him and fix it. But I don't want to hear. But ma'am, you're his next of kin, Macha said. The law requires. I don't care what the law requires. She closed her eyes and took a breath. I'm sorry. This isn't your fault. But as of this moment, I absolve all responsibility for that man. I am done. She turned and left through the sliding door, almost running into it, as if she couldn't get out fast enough. Macha turned to Cass. What should I do? He shrugged. I don't know. I'm just a citizen. If I were you, I'd follow her orders. Macha pursed her lips. Are you on her ship? A passenger? Yeah, just a passenger, Cass said. Well, you're obviously important to her, no matter who you are. She's never brought anyone with her before. Please make sure she takes care of herself. I know how hard these past few years have been. Had this been my father? Yeah. Cass watched the closed door, as if she might return. Shitty fathers are something the two of us have in common. She was nearly to the lobby when he caught back up with her. Are you okay? Cass asked. Fine, she replied, in a curt tone which suggested anything but. She shuddered again and shook out her hands, taking deep breaths as they walked. I'm just startled. It didn't look like that to him. In fact, it looked very similar to the sensations he'd felt before entering the shuttle. She was on the verge of a panic attack, and she knew it, but somehow she was managing to keep it at bay. Cass couldn't even imagine what it must feel like to endure an assault from one's own father. She would need help when they got back to Tempest, and if he knew her as well as he thought he did, she'd refuse every opportunity, not wanting anyone to think she needed help or was compromised in any way. Which meant he needed to step up to bat. Macha had made him feel better about their relationship when she revealed Evie had never brought anyone else to see her father with her. Perhaps the relationship wasn't as strained as Cass assumed it was, and he could take a more active role in helping her. Because if he was helping Evie with her issues, it meant he didn't have to think about the one thing that had been plaguing his mind ever since the nebula. In fact, focusing on her problems would be more responsible, because she had an important role on the ship. If Cass was compromised in some way, it wouldn't affect a damn thing on the ship, whereas Evie's incapacitation could leave the ship vulnerable. So he was doing the entire ship a favor by helping her out. Shittiest vacation ever, huh? He asked as they stepped back out into the fresh air. It was still as cool and breezy as it had been when they'd arrived. She only made a small noise in response. Would it help if you could watch them strap him down and smack him senseless for a while? No, I never want to see that man's face again, she said. They reached the shuttle, and she tapped the side of the door, waiting for it to open. But she must have missed, or not held her finger on the panel long enough, because it didn't move. In frustration, she hit it again, even more haphazard this time, and predictably, it didn't respond again. Damn it! She punched the side of the shuttle with her bare hand. Cass could have sworn he saw a small dent that hadn't been there before. Wide-eyed, he looked at her hand, which he'd surely broken. It was red, but not swelling yet. She was in for a trip to sick bay as soon as they got back. Cass reached across and held his hand on the pad, and the door opened. Evie stomped inside, not bothering to say anything. Is there anywhere else on the planet we could go for a while? We don't have to be back to Tempest for a few hours. A nice beach? No. We're going back to the ship. She took the pilot seat. I want to get underway as soon as possible and leave this fucking planet in our undercurrent trail. Cass took the other seat, stamping down his own anxiety about being back inside. It had reasserted itself as soon as the door had opened, but he found if he focused on Evie's issue, it wasn't as bad. He could function a lot better being distracted. The door to the shuttle closed, and he felt a rush of adrenaline, but ignored it, instead watching her face for any signs of distress. "I guess you win in the horrible dad contest," Cass said. "I mean, mine sucks. But he's never held me down and spit in my face." "He's never..." She rubbed her thumbs across her fingers a few more times. "Never done anything like that. He's got to be on precipitol or some other strength-enhancing drug. Did you see how he just knocked Matcha away?" Cass nodded. She was right. He had been strong for as frail as he looked. Cass had barely been able to hold him down. Evie turned to him. "No one knows about this. Understand? You say nothing. Not even to Box." He nodded. "I wouldn't. Trust me. I know family stuff is sacred." She took a breath. "Thank you." The shuttle lifted off the pad and ascended quickly, the facility dropping out of sight as they reached the cloud level. 11. Evie brought the shuttle into the bay, relying on her familiarity with the controls to guide them in, as her mind was completely preoccupied with what had just happened down on the planet. What had just happened? One minute, she'd been confronting her father about his behavior, and the next minute, she'd learned her mother's name and her apparent fate aboard the Austin while he held her down. He'd never, ever touched her like that before, and in those few brief moments, she had felt more vulnerable than in any other time in her life, and she hated him for it. She hated herself for it, for allowing him to get the jump on her and make her feel weak and helpless again. The first thing she needed was a shower, then some time at the gym, where she could hit a bunch of things really hard. Because above all else, she was angry. If she didn't exercise that anger somewhere, she would end up taking it out on someone who didn't deserve it. Evie landed the shuttle in its assigned space, then ventured to glance at Cass. Out of all the times to bring someone with her down to the planet, of course he'd have been the person who had to help her, to save her, if that's how he wanted to see it. But it just didn't make sense. She shouldn't have needed his help. She'd tried every maneuver she'd learned in combat training to get an enemy combatant off you, and none had worked. It had been like her father had been an immovable stone perched on top of her. She refused to believe her fear had made her too scared to throw him off. No, it had to be something in the system. An enhancement drug, though she had no idea why anyone would want to slip those to an old man, or why he would want them. She powered down the shuttle sequence and took a deep breath, only then realizing Cass was staring at her. Grimacing, she got out of her chair to get out from under his accusatory stare. "Why didn't you call for help, Evie? Why would he let him do that to you? Are you okay? Can I call a doctor?" She wanted none of it. She just wanted to go back to her quarters for a few minutes, reset, then get on with her job. Anything to distract her from this. The shuttle doors opened, and Evie stepped out to find Laura standing at the other side of the bay, staring at her. Shit. "I'll, leave you to it then," Cass said behind her, causing her to spin around. "Just let me know if you need anything." She hated how patronizing that sounded. "I'll be fine," she said, as he took one last look at her before scooting past her and walking away. She regretted bringing him with her. If she'd just gone down to the planet by herself, no one would have been the wiser. But now someone else knew. And worse than that, he'd seen her in one of the lowest moments of her life. Cass nodded to Laura as they passed each other, the lieutenant taking cautious steps toward Evie, who still hadn't moved from the shuttle's side. Laura averted her eyes every couple of seconds, almost like she was approaching a wild animal. "Hi," she said. "Lieutenant?" Evie replied, her voice cold. Laura played with her small fingers while avoiding Evie's gaze. "How was your trip? Did everything go okay?" "Fine. Is there something you need?" She reached back and pulled her bound ponytail back over her shoulder. "No. I wanted to make sure you... Laura huffed, as if she couldn't find the right words. I want you to know I'm here to talk about anything. Evie's heart rate shot up. Could she know already? Had Matcha sent a communique to the ship while they were en route? Even if she had, it would have only gone to the captain. And Green wouldn't have shared that information with anyone. I'm sorry? My parents weren't around much when I was a kid, and I know you're an only child like me, so I know how hard seeing your dad again probably was, she said. Evie exhaled. Okay, so it wasn't as bad as she thought. But still, Laura knew why she'd gone down to the planet. How did you know I went to see my father? Oh. Her cheeks flushed. I'm sorry. I just assumed. I saw from his service record, Sypaxia was listed as his last place of residence. I didn't mean to. No, you were right, Evie said. The trip was fine. Everyone is doing well. Laura seemed to stumble. Commander, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to intrude on your personal life. I just thought... It's fine, Evie said. If you'll excuse me. She stepped around Laura and broke into a quick stride across the bay. Oh, yes, of course, Laura said, though Evie didn't turn back to her. She felt bad, but Laura wasn't her primary concern. She needed to get this feeling of filth off her, and she needed time to think. What he'd said about her mother, that couldn't have been true, could it? She wasn't sure if she was ready to find out or not. 20 minutes later, Evie had incinerated the uniform she'd worn down to the planet and taken a scalding hot shower, to the point where even the computer had notified her the heat level was at maximum, and any hotter would run the risk of burns. She didn't care. Zax could grow her a new epidermis if necessary. She felt marginally better after the shower, but not completely clean. She grabbed one of her unused uniforms and slipped it on, realizing she'd never broken it in. It felt like her first days out of the academy again, and the stiff cloth against her skin was yet another distraction she'd rather deal with. As usual, she pulled her dark hair back into the low ponytail, wrangling it all together and binding it with a crosshatch pattern bind. It was the simplest way to keep all of it out of her way without a band that pulled on her scalp all day, and she liked how the ponytail felt resting on her shoulder, like one of those, what do they call them? Familiars? Like her own personal familiar. It was fuzzy, after all. She didn't spend much more time in front of the mirror, instead taking a seat at the small desk in her room and running a comparative scan on anyone named Amanda who had served on the Austin. She thought she remembered at least one from previous years of research. But it had been so long since she'd looked, she might have imagined it. Not that she expected it to result in anything. Her father had been mad with rage when he'd said those things. There was a better chance Evie would just never know about her heritage, and that was fine. She'd made it this long without knowing. What was another 70 years or so? The search came back with one match, showing up as a blinking line on her holo display. Amanda Lawson, Lieutenant Junior Grade, Evie said to herself. She tapped the line which expanded to a full biography, though there wasn't much there. Born 2548 on Earth, attended the academy at 17, parents unknown? That was odd. And she was young. She would have only been 20 when Evie was born, while her father would have been closer to 40. Her father was a lot of things, but a womanizer he was not. He'd never shown any interest in women outside his own age range, and the few he had ever shown interest in were scholars of some kind, not junior lieutenants on starships. Maybe she had the wrong Amanda. Evie went back into the records and searched again, using different permutations to spell the name, coming up with nothing. The only other thing in Lawson's file was the Austin had been her only assignment, and she was listed as KIA/MIA after its destruction in 2567. She'd been listed as a maintenance assistant, with few accomplishments under her belt. No commendations, no special recognitions, no anything. She was almost like a ghost. Evie expanded the search beyond just the Coalition Central Database. Maybe she had other mentions somewhere, like a brief sports career or academic activities. But everything came up blank. Had this woman been a hermit? Someone must have known her, or been friends with her. Evie searched for any visual data, coming up with only one picture of a young girl, probably in primary school, having been caught looking back at the camera as the actual subject of the photo posed in the foreground. Her face was blurry, and it was difficult to make out the details. But the computer confirmed that had been her. That had been Amanda Lawson. There was only one way to be sure. Using her officer's authority, she searched the sealed files for a copy of Amanda's DNA sample. That would tell her everything she needed to know. What the fuck? A giant "not found" flashed in red before returning to the previous screen. That was impossible. Everyone of the Coalition had their DNA on file. It was required. That information was then uploaded into a database that was then backed up over 3 different systems. A breach in one wouldn't affect the other 2. Not that there had ever been a breach, but something was very wrong here. She needed to see someone about this. People didn't just vanish from the database. The records went back thousands of years. A perfect record of human genealogy. Evie stood and paced the room. Maybe she should talk to Zax or the captain. Someone should know the records had been tampered with. The Coalition might have been dealing with a breach for years and not known about it. Just as she was about to create a new message, a call came across her comm. It was Matcha. 12. How many times would he have to be in this core-forsaken shuttle bay in one day? Cass waited for the shuttle to land itself so its passengers could disembark. And why was he down here anyway? He wasn't a diplomatic liaison. He was a temporary engineer who wasn't even part of the Coalition Navy. But Green had ordered him down here anyway to greet the new engineer who would be taking over Blum's station. He wasn't sure if he was relieved or not. Excited? Box asked, standing beside him. Not really, Cass replied. He really wished he hadn't passed Box in the corridor on the way down here. How is it you seem to be able to leave your post in sickbay whenever you feel like following me around? Zax knows I'm reliable. Not only that, but I managed to convince her you're a walking hazard, and wherever you go, pain is sure to follow. It never hurts to have a doctor around. Is that what you are now? A doctor? And what do you mean, a walking hazard? I'm not... Box turned to him, the fingers on his hand outstretched. Dare we forget crewman Zorus, whom you almost killed with a shuttle, he said, one of his metal fingers curling down. Well, that was... Or the time you sucker-punched Lieutenant Page in the face. A second finger curled down. Now, wait a second. He was asked, or the gentleman you assaulted back on 8. The 3 hulks who were only politely asking you to leave. A third finger disappeared. They were pushing me. All I did was... And we can't forget poor Maddox, whom you threatened with a gun to his head. The last finger fell, so only his thumb remained outstretched. Hold on. That wasn't even in Coalition space, Cass said. And I didn't do anything to him. He was drunk. Still, my analysis holds water. Out of the entire crew, you have caused 200% more collateral damage than the average member. You need to be watched. Cass huffed. At least Box had enough tact not to mention the shuttle accident. Ironically, it was the only one of those incidents Cass did feel responsible for. Whatever, he said, as the shuttle in front of them touched down. And yes, I am calling myself doctor. Just don't tell Zax yet. I don't think she'd approve. I still have to take the tests, which will be a cinch. Cass rolled his eyes. It was better not to get him started. The truth was he hadn't been back to sickbay much since Box had taken a full position there, shadowing Zax and the nurses. But he'd heard nothing but good things. People even seemed to appreciate his bedside manner, which boggled Cass. The shuttle powered down, and the door slid open to reveal the pinkest, spikiest mohawk Cass had ever seen. It was attached to the head of a woman with a very self-assured look on her face as she stepped off the shuttle and approached them. Keely Wolf, she said, sticking out her hand to Cass. You're the new engineer? He took her hand and gave it a shake. Guilty, she said. She looked at Box. Oh, an AMR-117. Is he fully loaded? More than you can imagine, Box replied. Your choice of hairstyle is not regulation. His optics fixed on the top of the lieutenant commander's head. Nope. She shrugged off her outer jacket and tossed it to the side, where it landed on a pile of containers. She ran her hands up the sides of her close-shaved head and up the length of the mohawk, as if she were preening it. Let's hope it stays that way. If everyone gets one of these, I might have to do something drastic. She looked between them. I can see you're puzzled. God, it's every time. See, they tried to kick me out, but I'm such a fucking good engineer, they decided they'd put up with some eccentricities rather than lose me. Is all your hair pink? Box asked. Excuse me? Cass coughed, trying to interject. Does it grow that color? From your armpits and pubic areas? Lieutenant Commander Wolf stared at Cass as if she couldn't believe what she'd heard. But a giant grin formed over her face. Is he for real? Unfortunately, Cass replied. Just what kind of autonomous mining robot are you? I'm sorry, you have to ignore him. He suffers from a condition I like to call too much mouth and too little filter, Cass said. It's a valid question, Box argued. How am I supposed to know? She could be a mutant variant. You don't know if you don't ask. It's dye, Wolf said, still clearly amused. And no, I don't dye all my hair this color. See, Box said. Now aren't you glad I asked? We know something about the commander we didn't before. Cass only hung his head. You're Robeaux, right? Wolf stifled a laugh. Again, unfortunately, he said. And this is Box. I find it easiest to ignore 90% of what comes through his voice processor. I think he's brilliant, she replied. Box made a slow turn toward Cass, and he knew if the machine had a human face, he'd be grinning from ear to ear. Instead, his optics blinked a very pleasing pattern of yellow. Did you hear that? In case you missed it, I made a recording. Something clicked inside Box, and Wolf's voice came from his speaker, clear as day. I think he's brilliant. Cass groaned. As much as I hate to cut this short, I really need to get my ass up to the bridge and talk to the captain. He said it was urgent I get situated as soon as possible, Wolf said. You guys have been missing an engineer for a while? Sorry. Yes, that's why we're here. I'm to escort you. He's just here to be annoying. Cass stepped to the side to allow the commander to pass. No, I'm here because you're a danger to others, Box replied. Cass grimaced at him behind the commander's back and motioned with his hand for him to cut it out. As expected, Box ignored him. Did you know he almost killed a fellow crew member with a shuttle a few weeks back? I was the one who fixed her. Cass rubbed his temple and stepped into stride behind them as the three made their way out of the bay. I like your robot, Wolf said as they rode the hypervator to the bridge level. He's not my robot. He's his own person these days. He just gets a kick out of getting under my skin. He's remarkably good at it. They'd left Box back down in 14. He said he trusted Cass not to punch anyone while escorting their new crewmate to the bridge. Sometimes he really could get on Cass's nerves. He reminds me of my husband. He's always making a crack about something or other. Drives me up the wall. Cass glanced at her. You're married? She straightened the front of her uniform. 6 years. Stupid, right? Both of us being in the service means we're never on the same ship, so we see each other maybe 3 weeks out of the year when we're on leave together. I don't know. Maybe I'm old-fashioned. Or maybe I didn't like the idea of that man hopping all over the galaxy without being tied down. Trust me, I'm doing everyone a public service. It's not unheard of. Both my parents were in at the same time, but Dad stayed on Earth. Mom was off in the stars most of the time. It can be a real kick in the nuts, but man, for those 3 weeks, the sex is unbelievable. She gave him a wink. So, what happened to your last engineer? Her entire body seemed to radiate energy. She was probably Cass's age, maybe a little older, but acted like she was in her early 20s. "Mission gone bad," Cass said, all the humor draining from his voice. Wolf lifted her chin. "You knew her? The last one?" "Yeah," Cass said, not liking how flippant Wolf was being with Susanna's memory. "I knew her well." "Sorry to hear. It's never easy. I've lost more friends than I want to count. And usually it's for something stupid like a survey team missed an indigenous species on a planet, or because someone hadn't programmed an anti-grav properly. Humans can be real fuck-ups, you know." "It wasn't her fault," Cass said. The walls of the hypervator seemed a lot closer. He drew a deep breath, then another. "Hey, are you okay?" Wolf bent over so she could look him in the eye. "You've gone really pale." The doors opened at the bridge, and Cass took another breath as he exited, happy to be out of that small space. Wolf followed behind, and he could still feel her eyes on him as he entered the larger space. "Ah, Mr. Robeaux. This is our new bridge engineer, I presume." Green stood from his chair. He didn't seem put off by the hair at all. Instead, came over and offered a hand to Wolf, who took it smiling. Cass glanced at Evie, who looked about how he felt. Still, she stood as well and introduced herself to the new engineer, then proceeded to show her to her new station. Cass wasn't sure if they'd explained to her this wasn't a regular assignment, and she wasn't technically going to be the chief engineer. "You've got who on board?" Wolf asked, her voice animated. "Holy shit!" She turned to Green, a sheepish look on her face. "Sorry, sir. I've only met one Klaxian before." Evie seemed bemused and shot Cass a look. Was he supposed to tell her? He didn't think so. No one had mentioned it. All the captain said was to meet her in the bay and escort her to the bridge. "This I gotta see," she said, heading back toward the hypervator. "Cass, will you show her around engineering? Introduce her to Sester and the others, just to make this transition easy?" Evie asked. The last thing Cass wanted to do was get back in that hypervator and endure more questions about Susanna or Sester or anything for that matter. All he really wanted to do was go lie down. But then he remembered what had happened down at the planet, and he wasn't about to start arguing with Evie after that spectacle. She was still probably on edge, even though it had been over a day now. "Sure," he said. "I can't fucking believe it," Wolf said, her eyes alight with excitement. "An actual Klaxian. You guys have been holding out." Cass took one last glance at Evie and the captain before boarding the hypervator again. The captain seemed completely pleased with the encounter, which Cass couldn't help but find odd. He was a man of few words and zero nonsense, and yet he'd taken to this brash new engineer like she was a relative. Maybe Green was one of those few humans who'd been able to relinquish all his prejudices. Cass had almost been like that once, until he'd gone back to the Sargan Commonwealth, where discrimination was alive and kicking with no signs of slowing down. But when he saw Evie's eyes, he swore there was something else there. Gratitude, maybe? He couldn't be sure. He got back in the hypervator as Wolf started up another line of questioning. The door to Cass's quarters slid open, revealing the sparse room. It was the most beautiful thing he'd seen all day. He wished he could shed his skin along with all his clothes and sleep for about a week in nothing but its pure essence. The trip down to engineering had been another Q&A session, only this time he was the subject. Wolf had heard of him, but thought he was dead or still imprisoned somewhere. Cass had to explain what he could, leaving out the bits about Rutledge and how he headed a group of people intent on betraying the Coalition's ideals in the name of security. Only it turned out Rutledge had been right, which was probably why no one else had suffered the same fate yet. Without the crew of the Atlas, all the evidence Evie presented could be contained to him and him alone. So they threw him under the shuttle and went along with figuring out a way to keep this new threat at bay. But Wolf didn't need to know any of that, and he hadn't seen fit to tell her. When they got to engineering, she'd been too enamored by Sester to question Cass further. Fortunately, it looked like she couldn't understand the commander like Cass and a few others could. and Cass was happy to let Ensign Tyler relay Sester's thoughts to her verbally. After a few minutes, he'd managed to excuse himself without anyone but Sester noticing, and made his way back to his room. He was exhausted. As he pulled off his shirt, he noticed he had an incoming message waiting. He went over to the small desk and tapped on the incoming notice icon on his display. An image of Matcha popped up on the holoscreen in front of him. "Mr. Robeaux, I hope you don't find this too forward, but I was worried about the commander. This business with her father seems to have put her on edge, and well, I'll just go ahead and tell you. Mr. Diazal passed away a few hours ago. It wasn't too long after you left. We're still waiting on the autopsy, but the coroner seems to think it was due to his degenerative disease, though she said there were a few strange things about his body. Perhaps the commander is right, and he was on something." She glanced behind her, as if she thought someone might catch her sending the comm. Though Cass wasn't sure why that would matter, it wasn't a secret. "Anyway, I wanted to let you know, because I sent word to the commander, but never heard anything back. I'm worried about her. The attack may have affected her more than she realizes, and as her friend, I thought you should know what was going on, even though I'm technically breaking protocol by giving up medical information to a non-family member. But Mr. Diazal doesn't have much family who will talk to him, so I'm reaching out to you. Just make sure she's okay. You won't be hearing from me again." The screen went blank, and Cass slumped down on the bed. No wonder she'd look so strained on the bridge. This entire thing must be torture for her. But at least now it was over. She could take solace knowing he was dead and couldn't hurt her anymore. Cass made a mental note to ask her to lunch the following day. He didn't need to bring it up, but at least he could be there for her. But all that could wait. He pulled his pants off and crawled into bed, falling asleep before his head hit the pillow. 13. Evie jolted out of bed, a cold sweat enveloping her. She couldn't get enough air. It was too thick, too hot in here. She jumped from the bed and ran to her washroom, turning the shower all the way to cold and putting it on full blast. She got underneath the water still fully clothed, allowing the cold water to course over her until her teeth were chattering. She turned the water off and wrapped herself in a thermal towel, though it couldn't do its job with her clothes sopping wet. She didn't care. She trudged back into her main quarters, leaving a trail of water behind her. "Check temperature," she commanded the local computer. On the display beside her desk, it flashed 20 degrees Celsius. Then why was it so core-forsaking hot in here? She threw the towel off and felt a fresh wave of cool air as her wet clothes clung to her skin. Without turning the lights to full luminosity, she could already see there was a dark spot on the bed where she'd been sweating for probably hours. This was getting ridiculous. Every single night since she'd come back from Sypaxia, and it was only getting worse. She wished they'd just leave orbit already. How many more repairs were required? The captain thought they had plenty of time thanks to Zenfor's advanced drive systems, but being in orbit of this planet was slowly driving her insane. And just the fact that she thought her mental state could be affected by staying in orbit of a planet was enough of an argument for her sanity. It didn't matter if he was dead. It was still his place. She should feel better. She should be happy she didn't have to deal with him anymore. But the truth was, it wasn't over. Matcha had sent 4 different messages. The first informing her of his passing, and the subsequent 3 about the results of his autopsy, the distribution of his belongings, and the matter of what to do with his remains. Evie wanted nothing to do with any of it. She'd been clear back on the planet. The Coalition could take responsibility for him from now on. But Matcha seemed determined to keep Evie involved. She grabbed the thermal and returned to the washroom. She wasn't about to go to sleep again tonight. Not after the horrid stream of images that wouldn't leave her alone. Her father's bloody, decaying face inches from hers, spouting nonsense as parts of his skin dripped down onto her, each landing with her own little squelch. She shuddered and stripped, returning to the shower again, and this time giving herself a proper scrub down. So maybe she'd been taking 2 or 3 per day. So what? Was her skin almost raw at this point? She didn't care. All that mattered was she got clean. She dried quickly and got back into uniform. Though when she did, she had to stifle a yawn. That was not good. She would not be out there yawning while trying to do her job. She opened a small compartment of the washroom and retrieved some stims from a tiny bottle. They weren't illegal, though use of any kind of neurological stimulant was typically only administered by a coalition doctor, or at least with their knowledge. But not this time. She didn't use them often, but she kept a small supply on hand just in case her performance ever began to suffer. She'd managed to refill this batch on her last jaunt to Sargon space to collect Cass. Cass. As she downed the stims and took a handful of water, she tried not to think about what she was going to tell him. Should she even mention that her father had died? Or would he even care? Maybe it was better to just keep it to herself. Though after what happened down on the planet, he would inevitably bring it up, if for no other reason than to brag about knocking the man off her. No, that was unfair. Cass wasn't like that. He wouldn't brag. At least she didn't think he would. But he would want to talk about it at some point, and she needed to decide just how much she wanted to tell him. Foregoing another look in the mirror, Evie made sure her hair was bound, then headed for the door. She'd just get to her shift a couple hours early. Nothing wrong with putting a little extra time in. Maybe she could get an updated repair schedule, so she'd at least know when they were scheduled to depart this wretched system. But before reaching the door, her eyes caught and hung on her sword, mounted to the wall like some great trophy. Despite her love for Grandma Adeline, she had still birthed that monstrosity of a father. And the last thing she needed was any more visual reminders of the man. She grabbed the sword, locked the sheath, and wrapped it in a blanket from her bed. She then tossed it in the back of her closet, behind her spare uniforms, and strode out the door. "Commander?" As Evie entered the bridge, she glanced over to see the new engineer, Wolf, at Blom's old station, staring at her. "You're not due for another few hours." Wolf was the highest-ranked person on the bridge, and should have been in charge before Evie arrived. But since she was still new, that authority hadn't been granted by the captain yet. Instead, Lieutenant Uma at Tactical was overseeing third shift. Navigation was empty, while Ogwin was at the helm and handled manned ops. Third shift was always a skeleton crew, except in times of emergency. "You're here early yourself," Evie replied. Wolf smiled sheepishly. "I needed to get some more time in on your systems. These Dragon-class ships are unlike anything else in the Coalition. It'll be strange not working in engineering." Wolf struck Evie as someone who was very comfortable with change, except when it came to her authority, though she couldn't blame her. Blom had expressed similar issues when Evie had first come aboard. It would be like Evie trying to share the executive officer position with someone else. 2 people trying to occupy one spot. The situation was further complicated by the fact Sester needed a translator for his thoughts. Another reason she'd wished Cass had been able to take the position in some way. At least he could understand Sester. "You came to us from the Hiawatha," Wolf finished. "That fucker is a monster, and it's old, but it's durable. Never seen another ship that could withstand 4 ion storms without so much as 1 ruptured conduit. They didn't build that ship, they poured it." Evie could feel the stims kicking in, forcing her brain to work despite the early hour. "She's a reclaimed warship, right?" Wolf nodded. "Yep, one of the last. Turned her into a cargo frigate. The Coalition had us going all over the place. And it's mostly just the shipping lanes, nothing new. So when I saw the chance to get on another ship, I jumped. I just didn't know what I'd be jumping into." Evie forced a smile. "You'll get used to it. It takes time with everyone." "Is it true only certain members of the crew can hear Commander Sester?" Evie swallowed, not wanting to reveal something she shouldn't. "It's only a select few, some with a genetic anomaly that makes them receptive to hearing the Claxians' thoughts." Wolf put her hands on her hips and surveyed the bridge. "Damn! Wish I could do that. It'd make things a lot easier." She took a breath. "But I'm not complaining. Just venting, I guess. I don't mean to keep you, Commander. Sometimes I just find myself talking aloud." Evie waved her off. "It's part of my job to make sure you're well acclimated. Let me know if there's anything I can help you with." "Thanks." Wolf returned to her station, her mohawk shaking slightly as she sat. Evie liked the new engineer, even if she was unconventional. That seemed to be what this ship needed. She walked over to one of the system displays and pulled up her own personal access, looking through any of the ship statuses to see if there were any notes from Green about a departure time. She didn't see anything in any of the logs, though it looked like the route to Omicron Terminus had already been plotted. Amazingly, they'd be there in only 5 days. It was a trip that should take 200 or more. If the Sill had this kind of technology in all their ships, it was a wonder they hadn't conquered the entire galaxy by now. But apparently that wasn't their goal. All they wanted was to be left alone. And Evie would be happy to oblige as soon as this threat was neutralized. She scrolled further and found the repairs were due to be complete within the next hour, which meant they shouldn't be here for more than another 2 before departure, right in time for first shift to start again. All she had to do was keep herself busy until then. She stifled another yawn. 14. "This is the last time I'm doing this for you." Buck stormed into Cass's room. Cass had been half asleep, nodding off while reclining at his bed, before he was startled awake by the robot bursting into his personal space, causing him to shoot up off the bed. It had been 5 days since they left Hypaxia, and they weren't getting any easier. "Doing what?" he said, his heart racing. Box tossed a bottle of liquid in Cass's direction, and he barely caught it before it hit him in the stomach. "You're McDoey's," he said. 3 bottles in as many days. We're due to reach Omicron Terminus this afternoon, and you're going to be smashed." "It's McDooley's," Cass said, not bothering to glance at the familiar bottle. "And thanks." "That's it. No more," Box replied. "I had to hide it in one of my leg compartments to get it out of the bar. Marshall knows it's me. If he catches me, I'll make this one last, I promise," Cass said, cracking the cap on top and allowing the liquid smell to permeate his nose. It was earthy, with a hint of vanilla and wood. Perfect. "I don't need this kind of heat. I'm a solid citizen now," Box continued, oblivious to Cass. He'd begun pacing the room, throwing his hands up at random intervals. "Who's the first person they'll blame? The robot." Yeah. I saw him go into the bar just the other day," Box said in a perfect imitation of Ensign Tyler's voice. "That robot has been nothing but a menace since he came aboard the ship. I'm surprised it took him this long to get caught," Lieutenant Rond. "He's been stealing my wares for months, but I finally got him on visual. Marshall, a perfect imitation." "Okay, I get it." Cass took the bottle over to his desk. "No more swiping booze. I'll find something else." "What? Hydraulic fluid?" "The human stomach can only handle so much abuse, and you've pushed yours to the limit," Box said. He stuck a finger into Cass's soft belly. Cass jerked and swatted him away. "Stop doing that." "Looks like you need gym time, Chubbs." "I'll spend my time however I like," Cass replied. "It's not like I have anything else to do." "Is that what this is all about? Because Wolf took your job? But you said you didn't want to do it in the first place." Cass didn't even bother finding a glass. Instead, he tipped the bottle back and took a swig. "I didn't." He wiped his mouth. "Boss, you're not making sense." "It doesn't matter." The alcohol didn't taste very good going down, despite being one of his favorite brands. He shoved the bottle to the side. "You're still upset over Commander Blum." Cass glared at him. "Correct me if I'm wrong, but don't human attachment feelings only develop after a prolonged period of time spent together? You and the Commander barely had any interactions. I don't understand." "It's not that simple, Box," Cass replied. There isn't a specific formula for feelings. You of all people should know that by now. But I'm not like you. Robot feelings are different than human feelings. Cass shook his head. They may not be as different as you think. Despite his resolution to help Evie, Cass still hadn't managed to get Susanna out of his head. It was like she was there, ready to take over any errant thoughts as soon as he stopped paying attention. Half the time he thought it was because she'd been attracted to him, and it was mourning the relationship that could have been. And other times, it was because of the guilt he felt over her death. He felt guilty for Griffin and Pearson too, but he didn't obsess over them day after day. It was like something in his brain had misfired, and he couldn't figure out how to fix it. I know what you need, Box said. Cass narrowed his eyes. Box pulled his entertainment device from the storage compartment in his crotch and turned it on, the image displaying against the far wall. Suddenly, the entire wall was filled with the image of two humans engaged in some very graphic sex. Box, what the— Wait, the camera needs to pan up, Box said, pointing to the image. Are you crazy? Why do you have hardcore— Shh! Box waved him down with his hand. Okay, see, here we get a good look at the man's face. True to his word, it was a very clear shot of a man's face. His eyes rolled back in his head as he bit his lip in ecstasy. Box paused the image. That's the look you need. Right there. When we get you to look like that, you'll feel a lot better. Cass sat on his bed and put his head between his knees. Oh, my God. It doesn't even have to be with another person, Box replied. Have you seen some of the machines they have available? We could even build you one. Put it right here in your quarters. I'll requisition the parts from engineering. Do it, and it will be the last conscious decision you ever make, Cass warned. And turn that thing off. The image was still paused on the close-up of the man, his mustache glistening with sweat. Box switched it off, depositing the device back into its original compartment. Why do you have that? His yellow eyes blinked a few times. Research. Research, huh? Zax told me I needed to become familiar with all types of biological functions, especially how species interact with each other. This isn't even the good stuff. You should check out the interspecies— Stop! Cass held up his hand. None of this is helping. Box crossed his arms. It's not my fault if you're a prude. Cass sighed. He didn't have the energy for this. He wasn't sure what he needed, but he was pretty confident it wasn't intercourse of any kind. He needed a purpose, and as far as he could tell, he'd become redundant here. Box didn't need him. Evie certainly didn't need him. And even Zenfor didn't seem to require him around anymore. She'd been working on her own, and also with the engineers, often with less and less input from Cass. It seemed she'd gotten over her phobias about being shuffled around. He also knew Sester was the real reason she was on the ship. Humans did very little for her. The Klaxian was the real draw. He sat back. Maybe he'd done all he could, and his future lay elsewhere. Maybe he'd just been a transitional device, something to get everything moving in the right direction. He still had his maps and access to Tempest shuttles. He bet he could even convince Ryan to help give him some cover if he wanted to leave, go off on his own like he'd always planned. I know that face, Box said. It's the same one you made every time Vina got on your nerves. The one that says, I'm tired of this shit, and I'm leaving. Damn the consequences. No, Cass said, feeling like a kid whose little brother had just caught him stealing. I was just what? Plotting your escape? Your selfish escape? It's not selfish when I can't do anything, Cass yelled. When I can't help anybody. What good am I here? What about the mission? Box asked. Are you just going to abandon everyone? What happens when the aliens arrive in Coalition space? Are you just going to ignore that too? Cass grimaced. We don't know what's going to happen. All we know is we don't know jack about them. Besides, I doubt I'd stay in Coalition space. I'd be more likely to head out to non-aligned territory. Selfish, Bach sing-songed. Yeah? And what about all the people I heard? You yourself pointed out I'm a walking time bomb, ready to take out anyone close to me. The fact is, I get people killed. Maybe if I'm by myself, I can limit the damage. Bach strode up and stood right in front of him. I am so sick of this self-pity routine. You want to feel bad for yourself? Fine. But don't pretend like you're the only person on the ship who gets to feel like shit because people died. You didn't purposely send them to their graves. They knew the risks. Your crew on the Atlas knew the risks. Blackburn, Griffin, Blum, they all took the same oath. You don't get to use their deaths as an excuse to run away from your problems. He poked Cass in the chest again, this time higher up, and it was hard enough to hurt. Cass's personal comm rang, and he tapped the back of his hand without taking his eyes off Bach's. Robeaux here. It was Evie. Cass, could you join us in the conference room? We need to go over some strategy. She sounded tired. Sure, I'll be right there, he replied, ending the comm. Can't help anybody, huh? Box asked, taking a few steps back. Yeah, well, we'll see, he replied, and left the room. Cass approached the hypervator and waited, Box's words echoing through his head. He wasn't sure when he'd made the decision, if he'd made it at all. But leaving seemed like the best idea at the moment, regardless of what his friend said. Green might even be willing to let him go willingly, though it would mean the loss of one of his shuttles. Though he'd be losing the shuttle one way or another. Cass just had to figure out a way to mask its signature. With its new advanced drive, Tempest could be in the most distant of locations in only days, as evidenced by the amount of distance they traveled since leaving Sypaxia. Omicron Terminus was far outside Coalition space, further out than any other ship had ever gone, though the system had been charted from the Coalition telescopes. But the trip should have taken a good season or two, at least 200 days or more, and they'd done it in only 5. Zenfor's technology was nothing short of remarkable. The hypervator doors opened to reveal Zenfor standing before him, staring down at him, and he jumped, as if she knew he was thinking about her. Caspian? She said, giving a slight nod. Headed to the bridge? He asked, stepping on beside her. I've been summoned, she replied. That makes 2 of us. How are things going down in the weapons lab? He averted his eyes. He didn't know how much Syl could tell by human facial expressions, but he didn't want to risk her thinking he missed being down there. Slow. Your technology is limited, and I can only do so much. I need... She sighed. What? I've broken my vow to my people. When Melesse finds out, she will see to it I am removed as consul of my ship. If she doesn't know already. I understand you spoke with Admiral Sangvi during your interrogation. It wasn't an By now she must know I've improved your engines. She may even decide to return to Syl space without me, though I haven't received any messages yet. Cass hadn't even thought of that. He'd spent most of the past few days in his room, where the rest of the crew were glued to either their scanners or the windows of the ship, excited to see something no other human or Coalition species had seen before. He should have been right there with them, updating his star maps, but instead, he passed the time by getting drunk and little else. But because there were no communication relay stations outside Coalition space, a message would have to travel as fast as it could back along an undercurrent. They really were alone out here. I take it Melesse won't understand, Cass replied. No. My people are rigid sometimes. She sighed again. I just don't know anymore. You never know, Cass replied, feeling odd he had to comfort a Syl. Your help might be what saves all this for us. And if that's the case, I'd think your people would be more lenient. Especially since they couldn't even make a decision regarding the matter. I doubt it, but it's a pleasant sentiment. The hypervator doors opened on the bridge, and they walked out together as Evie and Green turned in unison. "Seems we might have a problem," Green said, pointing to the screen. Cass looked to see the image of the Omicron Terminus system, with its red and blue supergiant stars and smattering of planets, moons, and other stellar bodies. It was obviously a long-distance image, as they were still a few hours out. "Which is?" Cass asked. "There's no fleet." "The aliens aren't here," Evie replied. 15. "I don't understand," Cass said, taking a seat in the conference room adjacent to the bridge. He'd been joined by Zenfor, Evie, Green, Zal, and Uma. "Neither do we," Green replied. "And we need to figure this out, because everything we've done has been predicated on this fleet being here. We were going to swing wide to avoid the system, observe them from afar. But when we got close enough for the scanners to pick up the system, we found it was empty." "What did Starbase 5 say?" "They're the ones who first saw the fleet, right?" Cass asked. "We've sent them a message, but it will take some time to get a reply," Evie said. "Which is why we asked the two of you here. We hoped you might have some ideas about what could have happened, or if Starbase 5 scans were tampered with in any way. We can't find any anomalies, but we may not be looking correctly." Cass's eyes narrowed. "Looking correctly?" "To be blunt," Evie began, and it was only now Cass noticed how tired she looked. Her eyes had dark circles under them, and she was paler than normal. Was her father's death having that much of an effect on her? "The two of you don't work within Coalition protocol. You don't have to. So maybe there's a way you can find something we can't. Some technique or, I don't know, something?" Green pressed his lips into a line. "I believe what the commander is saying is to use whatever resources you need. Help us figure out what's going on here." The door to the conference room slid open to reveal Wolf, strolling in like she owned the ship. "Sorry I'm late. Just finished analyzing the most recent scans." "Anything?" Green asked. She shook her head, taking the seat beside Cass. He had the immediate sensation to get up and leave, but stayed put. "Same as the last batch. I even use a spectral analysis I haven't used since I went up against the Sargans. They hid their ships in the gravity distortions of moons, but if you knew what to look for, you could find them easily." "You fought against the Sargans?" Cass asked, turning to her. She smirked. "Long time ago. And just border skirmishes. Nothing serious." "This is maddening," Green said. "We came all this way to find out this all might be some sort of practical joke?" "We should hear back from 5 in about 10 more hours," Lieutenant Uma said. "But the further we get, the longer it will take to receive a signal." "Until then, we need to brainstorm," Evie said. "I want every person on this that could even be the slightest bit helpful. Pull whomever you need. This is a top priority. If it turns out this is nothing but a hoax, and there never was a fleet, then someone will be answering for it." "And if it isn't a hoax?" Cass asked. "Then we need to find out where they went, and fast. The only advantage we had was surprise, and if they saw us coming, then we need to be very careful," Green replied. He was tense, his face strained with each word. It was possible the future of the Coalition rested on his shoulders, and Cass couldn't even imagine what he was thinking. "And you two," Evie pointed to him and Zenfor, "get started." Cass caught Wolf eye him with interest. Everyone else stood along with the captain, and they all exited. Cass and Zenfor headed back to the main hypervator off the bridge. "Thoughts?" Cass asked. "I have a few," she replied, "and I highly doubt this is a hoax." "Then why didn't you say anything in there?" "Because I don't know. Without evidence, a hypothesis is just that. I need to be sure before I risk my reputation." He scoffed as the doors opened and they stepped inside. "Are you headed back to the weapons lab?" "That's where all my equipment is," she replied. "Why would—" "Hey, wait up!" Wolf stuck her hand between the closing doors, and they slid open again. She stepped inside. "I'm headed down to engineering. Care to share a ride?" "Sure," Cass shrugged. The doors closed this time. "So, what is the deal with you?" Wolf asked. "I mean, when they told me they had a Klaxian on board, I didn't think it could get any crazier. But then to find out there's a Sill, too? It's like I've hit the jackpot. I'd heard progress had been made in Sill relations, but the news channels are keeping a tight lid on everything. I had no idea you were on ships already." "I'm the only one," Zenfor replied, "and this is temporary." "Still, it's a long way from the war, and you're just walking around like it's no big deal. The rest of the crew sees you and shrugs." Wolf stared at Cass. "I mean, how incredible is this?" "Yeah, I know. I was the one who helped convince her to come along." Wolf was exhausting. It was like she took all the energy in a given space and sucked it all up for herself. Talk about a motley crew. Not only do we have Sester, the only Klaxian on a coalition ship, but Zal, Zax, a Sill, and... She winked. "You. By the way, you never did tell me what it is you're doing on this ship. You're a civilian now, right? So why were you in the meeting?" He shrugged. "Maybe the commander just wanted my expertise. I used to be a coalition officer." "That was a long time ago. I mean, they told me you've been pardoned, and I get it. But why are you still here? Now I'm on board. They don't need you for the bridge engineer position." Cass glanced at Zenfor, who remained stone-faced. "I've been asking myself that same question ever since you arrived," he said. He tapped the panel beside him, and the doors opened. Cass pushed his way past, not caring about how rude it might seem. "Will you be in the weapons lab later?" Zenfor called after him. He didn't reply, only threw up a wave behind him as the doors closed again. What was he still doing here? Evie had called him up there as a courtesy, to keep him updated, but they didn't need him. There wasn't anything he could do that Zenfor couldn't down at the weapons lab. And she could probably do it better and faster. And it seemed Wolf had plenty of experience with the Sargans, so any advantage he might have been able to add there was already covered. He'd become completely redundant in the space of only a few days. So now what could he do? Fuming. He didn't even realize what level he was on until he looked at one of the bulkheads beside him in the long hallway. He'd gotten off on 3, on port side. There wasn't much over here other than a few good views outside the ship. He took a second to stop by one of the large windows to stare out at the passing stars. Suddenly, the view shifted, as if it had dissolved to something else, and he realized they'd just micro-jumped. He'd never actually seen it in action before. He'd managed to make it out to where no other humans had ever come before, where there was nothing out there but new things to discover. So why did he feel so alone? Evie rubbed her temples as everyone else filed out of the conference room. She caught Green giving her a sympathetic look from the door, and she smiled in return, not wanting to alarm him. "Trouble getting rest?" he asked, entering the room again. "It's nothing I can't handle." She blinked a few times, and hoping the redness in her eyes was dissipating. She'd go see Zax later about something that might help stave off the effects of not sleeping. But knowing their chief doctor, she'd probably chide Evie for using stims in the first place. At this point, she didn't care. "It's exciting, isn't it?" Green replied. "Being out here? I wish we could stop and look around, take in the sights. But I'm sure there will be plenty of time for that once all this is over." She didn't like the sound of his voice. It was too optimistic. Did he really believe the armada had been nothing more than an elaborate prank of some kind? "If we get the chance," she said, standing. "I doubt Zenfor will let us keep the wormhole technology. Even if they do take it back, with the Klaxians' advanced drive on every ship, it will be much faster. Think of all we could learn." She hadn't even considered it. Since seeing those ships, she hadn't thought about anything past getting to this point and confronting them. Everything else she'd ever planned for her life had been put on hold. There were no other future moments past the ones they were about to experience, because as far as she could tell, they would very likely be her last. She'd seen these aliens destroy an entire star. Even with the sill, how were they supposed to combat something like that? She brushed some errant hairs out of her face. We can hope, but I'm not willing to dismiss what 5 saw out there. Those results were verified 100 times over. They didn't just make it up. No, you're right. And I don't want to sound overconfident, Green replied. We need to stay on high alert. It's very possible these aliens have some technology shielding them from us in some way. We can't get complacent. She nodded and followed him back onto the bridge. Uma was taking her station again from Laura, who would come in just to hold tactical while Uma was in conference. Laura happened to glance up just as Evie entered the bridge, and their eyes locked. Evie turned away, her guilt gnawing at her from the inside. Laura had reached out to her, and she'd done nothing but slap her hand away. If she was smart, she'd stop trying before one of them got hurt. Laura didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. Her face said it all. Maybe it was too late for anyone not to get hurt. The hypervator doors closed, and she was gone. Evie took her chair again, bringing up the most recent scan data from Omicron Terminus, determined to keep her mind on her work. She stifled another yawn, and no sooner had she focused on the words on the holoscreen had they blurred, and she was back in that core-forsaken room on Sypaxia, her father holding her down. She shook her head at the image, trying to focus, but finding it difficult. What little sleep she had been getting hadn't been pleasant, and now she was thinking about it during the day. She couldn't keep going like this unless she wanted it to be obvious to everyone around her she was struggling. Maybe if she talked to Cass about what had happened. He'd been there, he'd seen it, though he probably thought it was no big deal. But Evie couldn't get over the terror she'd felt as her father held her down. The fact that she was unable to move or kick him off was the worst part of all. Despite having taken years of self-defense, it was as if he was a gravitational force in himself, and she was nothing but a speck of dust. Not to mention, he would think because her father was dead, she should feel better. On one hand, she'd been relieved, but on the other, it was even worse, because it meant those were the last memories she would ever have of her father. No, the man who raised her. That man had been no father, and she was tired of trying to pretend like they'd had anything but a contentious relationship. But still, it had never been that bad. She could only hope whatever had ravaged his brain to death wasn't genetic. If she became like that in her old age, she'd instruct the nurses to shoot her before she could traumatize anyone else. Not that she would have the chance. It wasn't as if there were any more Diazals around anymore. And based on what a shitty job Osborn had done with her, she wasn't even about to chance screwing some kid of hers up that badly. She wouldn't perpetuate a cycle of abuse to her offspring just because she needed to leave a legacy or some crap like that. Her professional career would be her legacy. That way, no one else could get hurt. 16. Captain Green couldn't help but study the images on the small holoscreen in front of him. Nothing about this felt right. But most of all, the entire mission itself hinged on the alien armada being here, and it just wasn't. He hoped to find some anomaly in the scans of the Omicron Terminus system, some explanation of what could have happened, or where the armada could have gone. He compared them to the scans Starbase 5 had taken over the past few seasons, each one with the encroaching armada ever nearer. He even adjusted their current scans to the same angle so he could switch back and forth between the two, only to find it was as if they had all vanished. The most recent scans from the system had been less than a week ago. Normally, a coalition ship couldn't have made the trip that fast, but then again, he wasn't on an ordinary ship. He tossed the device to the side of his desk
intent on finding some caffeine and a new resolve to discover this mystery.
Captain?
Lieutenant Uma's voice came through his command room comm.
Go ahead. We got word back from Starbase 5.
Green closed the comm and jumped up from his chair, striding onto the bridge from the adjacent room.
What do they say?
Uma tapped her console.
They confirm they can still see the armada holding position in this system, as we speak.
Green turned to the main view screen.
What the hell? He muttered.
Omicron Terminus was displayed on the screen as their main destination, their long-range scanners having reached out to take images and video of the system from their great distance. He made up his mind. He was going to figure out what was going on, and he was going to do it right now.
Wolf, can we do a short jump into the system using Zenfor's technology? He asked.
No problem, she replied, not looking up.
We're in range. Get us there now. Lieutenant, raise our shields and prepare all weapons. If they are hiding, I want to be ready.
He took the captain's chair. Evie leaned over to him.
Is this the best move, jumping right into the system? What if it's a trap? I'm done trying to figure this out. There's only one way to handle this, and that is to face it head on. If we are destroyed, the Coalition will know what's coming.
He turned back to the front.
River, set course. Rond, let's do it.
The navigation and helm officers nodded without turning, and the image on the screen in front of them went blurry for a moment before clearing, with the two supergiants in the system taking up most of the screen.
Report, Green said.
Nothing is coming up on sensors, Zal said. We have no indication of alien craft.
Full sweep of the entire system. If they're hiding here, we need to find them. And if they're not, we need to find out why 5 can still see them.
What are you thinking, sir? Evie asked.
That I'm tired of being jerked around. One way or another, there is something out here, and we're going to find it.
He turned to Uma.
Get Zenfor, and Cass if you need him. Let them know about all this data we're about to throw their way.
Aye, Uma replied, speaking into her own comm.
It's hard to fathom how big those are.
Evie stared at the giant stars on the screen. They were still a good distance from the center of the system, where the two were locked in an elliptical orbit of a common point, seeming to almost feed off one another. Omicron Terminus had a third Class F white star, which orbited both and had planets and a system of its own. The system was full of small planetoids, moons, gas giants, and a smattering of asteroid fields. Green took a moment to appreciate how no other Coalition species had ever seen anything this far away before.
It almost doesn't seem real, he said, echoing Evie's sentiments.
The two giants in the center of the system were some of the largest stars he'd ever seen, but not for much longer. The red giant was close to the end of its life cycle, and would either expand to intersect the blue giant, or it would collapse in on itself. Either way, when it did, the system would be forever changed, only a few 100 million years away.
The console has responded, Captain. She's analyzing it now.
Green relaxed back in his chair. He couldn't imagine the repercussions if no armada was found. How would the Sill react? Would they think it had all been nothing more than a ruse to peace talks? That was sure to set them off. And what about the incident back at the nebula? They would have cut off 2 whole planets, future members of the Coalition. And for what? Nothing. For the first time since this assignment began, he felt uneasy. Before, he'd been sure they were on the right track, whether that was building an alliance with the Sill or traversing Coalition space to get out here. He'd felt like they had a purpose, and now all that had been thrown into question.
Lieutenant? He turned to Uma. Did 5 say anything about malfunctions in their telescopes? Anything that might account for this discrepancy?
She shook her head.
They said they'd just been calibrated a few weeks ago, and were in top working order.
Captain, Wolf said, standing from her station,
I have an idea. These 2 stars are generating a massive gravitational field in the system, which may be disrupting how our sensors are seeing. Think about it. There's not another system in the Coalition with a blue supergiant and a red giant. 5 is almost 800 light-years away. Maybe from that distance, the effect is negligible.
What are you suggesting? Green asked. We take the shuttles out into the system, all of them, and the space wings, do a visual inventory of what's out there. We can cover a lot of ground with as many support craft as we have. In this case, our sensors may be lying to us, whereas our eyes won't. Green glanced at Zal, who was concentrated on his own station. She could be right, Captain. We are dealing with an unknown amount of gravitational energy in this system. We used to do the same thing back on Ark Nagali, when the pirates would use their scatter tech on us, Wolf said. It was like this lens that bent scans around their ships in pockets of heavy gravitation, but we could still see them. But if there is something out there, Green said, our ships will be close to defenseless against it. At least the shuttles. They have limited weapons. Then use the space wings as escorts, Wolf said. Simple. Green exchanged glances with Evie. The last time they'd used the space wings as escorts, they'd lost 3 crew members. He wasn't sure how the crew would react to being back in the same situation again, especially the wing pilots. He'd need to speak with Raffinkel, though they may not have a choice. What? Wolf said, her face awash in confusion. Did I say something? No, Green replied. I'll take it under advisement. Thank you, Commander. For the first time since he'd been aboard, Cass found himself on the upper levels of Tempest, staring out at the magnificent view before him. After taking in the view on 3, he'd come all the way up to Deck 1 to just watch, and maybe plot an escape. Though if he was realistic, that was just impossible. But it felt good to plan for it anyway. The windows were wide and large, big enough to get a great view of the system beyond. There weren't a lot of crucial systems on the levels 1 and 2, which made them more ideal for extravagances like observation decks. Stellar cartography was only a few short corridors down the way. Usually when he looked outside, it was a brief glance to tell if they were still in an undercurrent, or if they'd exited to normal space again. Cass never took the time to enjoy the stars anymore. That was something he'd had plenty of time to do on the reasonable excuse. He could spend days or even weeks studying them, watching them go by or updating his old maps with new coordinates or new discoveries, though new to him usually meant within the last 1,500 years, due to the age of his maps. But now he was staring at 2 stellar giants, each around a common orbit. The gravitational forces at work inside their orbits were almost incomprehensible. Green had decided to jump right to the system, no more pretense. And just as the scanners had said, there were no traces of any armada out there, just stars and planets. The few he could see, anyway. Excuse us. Cass moved to the side as 3 junior crew members ran past him, their arms full of equipment. He recognized them as part of the stellar cartography team. No doubt they were headed to gather as much information about the system as they could while Tempest was here. Cass smiled despite himself. He couldn't remember the last time he had that kind of optimism. And honestly, he wished for some of it back. Caspian, respond, his comm chirped. It was Zenfor. Go ahead, he said into the back of his hand. We've received the data from Starbase 5. Please come to the weapons lab. On my way, he replied, taking one last look at the star system before heading back down the corridor to the hypervator. It was nice Zenfor was including him, even though she didn't need to. She was perfectly capable of analyzing the data on her own. But from their brief discussion on their way to the bridge, he could tell she was troubled. Maybe she wasn't as impenetrable as she seemed. He stepped into the weapons lab moments later, his thoughts lost on what exactly he was going to do if this all did turn out to be a hoax. The inquiry had specifically said he'd be dealt with once the crisis was over. So what if there was no crisis? It meant he'd be seeing the inside of a jail cell within the week, most likely, as soon as they got back. There was never a better argument for leaving right now. If only he could convince Green to let him go. Without the Andromeda threat, it wouldn't be like he'd be abandoning anyone. He'd just be safeguarding his future. But it would be a hard sell to get Green to let him go. He needed to brush up on his negotiation skills. The starbase is still reporting seeing the armada. Zenfor broke him from his thoughts. She was hunched over her primary control panel, her shoulders bunched up. What? How can that be? We're here. There's nothing out there, he replied. I'm not so sure, she replied, staring at her screen. I've been comparing the data from 5 as well as the scans Tempest took on the way here. There are minor differences in radiative output. Something was here, and not too long ago. But it's impossible to tell what, for how long, and where they went. Your limited scanners have provided me with little to work with. So what does that mean? He asked. I don't know yet. But we know one thing. This isn't a hoax. "17. The shuttles. They were going back out in the shuttles. Cass took a few deep breaths and tried not to think about the accident. Of course, trying not to think about the accident was like trying not to think about a pink elephant. Once the image was in his mind, it was the only thing he could focus on. He couldn't believe, after what had happened at the nebula, they were about to send out more search parties to try and find these ships. And what were the shuttles supposed to do once they found one? Tap them lightly and say, "Tag, you're it"? Evie had sent him a comm letting him and Zenfor know the plan. Zenfor opted to remain in the weapons lab, studying the information from 5 and the current scans from the ship. But as Cass had suspected, she really didn't need his assistance. He'd asked her if they could use the same timestamp technique they'd used to observe the Iphigenia and Genesis, but she said the gravitational forces in the system would disrupt the process too much. They'd never be able to get a clear signal. Not that it mattered, as it seemed from a distance the armada could be seen, while up close was a different story. And now he was on his way to Bay 1 to climb aboard a shuttle and assist in the efforts. Everywhere he passed, there was a flurry of activity. Apparently, it was all hands on deck for this one. Evie had said they'd be using every available support craft they had on hand, which meant close to 60 ships scanning the system. As he made his way down to the bay, he felt almost as if he were having an out-of-body experience. He could see himself moving along the corridors, nodding to the few members of the crew he knew, everyone in a hurry to get to their destinations. It was a strange sensation, watching himself from a different angle, and yet he was still inside his own body at the same time. As soon as he reached the opening to Bay 1, he stopped cold. Some of the shuttles had lifted off, heading out into the system to begin their scans. For some reason, he felt like he was frozen to the ground. What was wrong with him? He'd just been on a shuttle only a few days prior, down to Hypaxia. It hadn't been a pleasant experience, but now it was as if a current of terror was running through him. He was about to take a step back when someone ran into him from behind, knocking him forward. He felt strong arms pull him back before he could hit the floor. "Whoa, sorry there," Dorsey Ryan said, letting go once he was sure Cass wouldn't topple over. He was one of the few Space Wing pilots Cass knew personally, and had been a good friend of Griffin. "It was my fault," Cass shook his head. "That'll teach me to stand in the middle of an entryway." He hadn't spoken to Ryan since before Griffin's funeral, and had no idea how the man would react to him. He was a good head taller than Cass, and probably had at least 20 pounds of muscle on him, too. "You headed out?" Ryan asked, indicating the shuttles taking off. "Supposed to be. After what happened." Ryan dropped his gaze. "I get it. Going back out there is the toughest thing you can do. Core knows I didn't want to. But if you don't do it now, you'll never see the inside of a shuttle again. Trust me." Surprised the man wasn't more antagonistic toward him, Cass pressed the point. "How do you do it? How can you go back out after something like that?" Ryan suppressed a laugh. "I keep forgetting you don't fly. I guess it's something pilots have in common. It's the first thing we have to do, because it's what we do. Licia wouldn't be able to stand the thought of me never going back out there again. She wouldn't want that for any of us. And I'm telling you, get back out there before the fear really takes hold. Before it becomes this chain you can't even lift, and you find yourself planet-side because you can't stand being on a starship anymore. It will fuck you up if you let it. The point is not to. A rush of people filed past them into the bay, each headed in a different direction. I just don't know what good it would do. There's plenty of people to cover the mission. Look, go pick a shuttle. Call me once you're on board, and I'll fly with you, okay? Cass? He turned to see Evie approaching with another contingent of officers behind her, including Wolf. See you out there, Ryan said, throwing up a hand signal Cass didn't know, but assumed it had something to do with the Space Corps. What's wrong? Did you get your assignment? Evie asked, as the rest of the officers, including Wolf, rushed past her. Yeah, I can't go back up there, Evie. My head isn't in the right place. I'd only be a liability. He hated letting Ryan down, but he knew if he got aboard that shuttle, he'd have a meltdown before they got out of the bay. He'd never had a problem with crowds before, but with the amount of people running around and all the noise from the shuttles and equipment being moved around, it was as if he couldn't even think. He needed the serenity of the viewing windows back up in one. This was too chaotic. Evie furrowed her brow. Her eyes were bloodshot, and her normally smooth hair was pulled together loosely. Maybe she shouldn't go up either. Fine, stay here. I'll reassign your shuttle to someone else. She pushed past him. Evie, He wasn't sure what to say. She'd given him what he wanted, hadn't she? He hated to disappoint her again. After everything at the nebula, he'd hoped never to disappoint anyone like that again. But some things just weren't meant to be. Cass watched through the large windows on one as the shuttles with their Space Wing escorts flew off in different directions, surveying the system. It seemed Green had ordered every support craft on board Tempest out there to search. While he didn't think it was a good idea, Cass couldn't blame him. This was what they'd come here for, after all. If they couldn't confirm the existence of the threat, heads would roll back at Coalition Central. But even though he was safe behind the main bulkheads of the ship, Cass still felt a pit of unease in his system. Something about all of this was wrong. Hopefully, Zenfor could come up with a solution. He hadn't seen her in the bays. She might still be on board running her tests. He watched another 2 shuttles launch, a Space Wing on each of their tails. There weren't enough Space Wings to escort every shuttle. Maybe they were running drills. Of course, one of the Space Wings would be sitting empty in Bay 2 at this very moment. Disgusted, he turned away and almost ran face first into Box, whom he hadn't even heard come up behind him. Whoa, boss. I know you like things personal, but this is too close even for me, the robot said. Cass rolled his eyes. What are you doing up here? I thought you would be on one of those shuttles searching the system. I had other duties to attend to, he replied, turning his gaze to the windows. The big question is, why aren't you? I didn't feel like going. Is that a crime? Do I always have to want to be in a shuttle somewhere? He suppressed a shudder. It was already difficult enough not being able to fly the stupid things. Now he wasn't sure he'd ever be able to get back onto one. Yes, you do. If you're not out there, it means something is wrong. Cass didn't reply. Instead, he stared back out at the ships and the system beyond as well. Many of them weren't visible anymore, each heading off for their own small points of light. He needed a graphical overlay so he could see where the planets and other stellar bodies in this planet. Ow! Cass yelled, as Box pulled the small device away from his upper arm. What the hell was that? He rubbed where Box had held the device. The area was red and inflamed. Something to calm you down, Box replied, depositing the device into one of his storage compartments. I had hoped to find you at the bar so I could make a pun about shots, but alas, the opportunity was missed. Panic rose in his voice. You gave me a shot? Of what? What did you inject into me? Nothing harmful, you big baby. It's a combination of a sedative and a muscle relaxant. A very mild dose of both. And before you ask, he stopped Cass's interjection, it came from Zax, not me. She's been worried about you since the accident. Worried about me how? I haven't even been to see her. She's been getting regular updates. From me, he replied, a satisfied blink to his eyes. Cass pulled his sleeve down to cover the spot. I thought doctors were supposed to keep information confidential. Not from other doctors, Box said. I was as surprised as you are. But no, we can gossip all we wish. You wouldn't believe some of the ailments on this ship. I bet I wouldn't, Cass mumbled, still rubbing his arm. Don't you need consent before you go giving someone drugs? Not if I determine they are in the patient's best interest, and the patient is combative, which you are. You don't deal with stress well, and this shuttle business has you all screwed up in the head. Here, Box produced a small container from another compartment, handing it to Cass. What's this? Same thing, just in a pill form, for you to take when you feel anxious. His face turned red. You mean to tell me I could have taken a pill instead of having you shoot me up like some science experiment? You know I don't like shots. Oh, here's my chance. You don't like one kind of shot. You love the other. He tapped his faceplate as if contemplating. Didn't come out quite right. Let me try again. When you said you wanted to go out for shots, this isn't what you meant? His eyes blinked rapidly. Still not getting it. Give me a minute. I can come up. Box. What? Just stop. He closed his eyes and leaned against the bulkhead, his forehead pressed up against the glass. Why did this have to be so hard? Oh, they're kicking in, Box said. You might want to go take a nap, or at least lie down for a few hours, or just do something relaxing, like read a book. I haven't had time to keep up with the net dramas, but I'm sure there's something good on one of the feeds. Maybe that's a good idea. Cass opened his eyes again and pulled himself away from the wall. He did feel more relaxed and less stressed. He pocketed the container of pills. Thanks, I guess. You're welcome, Box replied in a very satisfied tone. I hope you've enjoyed your care today. If you'd like to rate my performance, please do so on a scale from 1 to 10, with 1 being least favorable and 10 being the best care you could have possibly received. 2, Cass said, turning away from him. He was silent a minute, though Cass did hear an audible click from somewhere deep inside him. I'm sorry, your feedback form has been lost. Would you like to try again? Cass stifled a laugh as he made his way down the corridor, with Box close behind. It was the first time he'd smiled in days. 18. Everything all right, Commander? The words came through the shuttle's comm, pulling Evie from someplace she hadn't even realized she'd been. It was as if she'd been caught up in some thought that wouldn't reveal itself to her. She noticed her vector had drifted by 3 degrees. She made the adjustment on the shuttle's heading and tapped the comm. Sorry about that, Captain Wilmoth, she replied, flashing the Space Wing pilot a smile out the window to the ship on her left. The captain didn't reply, only gave a sharp wave of her hand and fell back into formation off Evie's left flank. We okay? Wolf asked from the back compartment of the small shuttle. Yeah, just got distracted for a second. Sorry, Evie replied. She was happy Wolf had volunteered to join her, as it gave Evie the opportunity to size up the engineer's capabilities. She hadn't had much time to go over her service record since she'd come on board, and this would be the perfect opportunity to see the lieutenant commander in action. I'm always up for a good distraction, as long as it's off-duty hours, Wolf said with a smile in her voice. Are you getting anything yet? Evie asked. Nothing yet, but we'll need to get closer to our target before I can be sure. If something is hiding in the gravity well, we'll practically have to be on top of it before we can see it. Great. If there was an enemy armada out here, they could just be waiting, practically invisible, and ready to pounce. Evie hadn't felt great about this from the start, but she hadn't had a better idea to try and reveal their locations, if they were even out here. Evie took a deep breath. There was no sense in getting worked up until they had something solid, and she didn't need to speculate on something she had no knowledge about yet. This was a wait-and-see situation, and due to the size of the system, it would take them another 15 to 20 minutes before reaching their destination, a pair of moons orbiting one of the smaller planetoids.
Did you spend a lot of time on Sypaxia?
Evie asked, needing to fill the silence with something.
Yeah. I've been down there for about a season now. Came off my last posting on the Hiawatha and needed some time off. 7 years in space will do that to a person. And Sypaxia seemed like the best spot. I still had another half a season for shore leave build up, but when you guys arrived, I couldn't skip the opportunity.
It looks like the weather down there suited you, Evie said. Wolf's skin was a deep shade of copper, and even through her uniform, Evie could tell she was muscular. Whether that was from Sypaxia or the commander was just built that way, she didn't know. But it reminded Evie she'd let her own physical training lapse. Ever since she'd used the sword to kill that Sargan, she'd stayed out of the gym, and she was starting to feel the effects.
Oh yeah, Wolf said. I don't know if you've been, but they've got everything you could want. Hiking, biking, swimming, water sports. All to keep the body healthy and happy. I've been, but not for very long. I need to get back to our gym soon.
Evie tried not to think about the encounter again.
Well, hey, if you're looking for a sparring partner, look no further. You guys have decent facilities for a smaller ship. Better than the Hiawatha had, anyway. Let's get something on the schedule.
I like that, Evie replied. She didn't necessarily need to train with a sword to get back in the gym. She could shift over to body contact, or work with a different type of weapon. Maybe it would be better to expand her skills anyway.
Cool.
Wolf plopped down into the seat beside her, one leg hooked over the arm of the seat as she stared out at the system before them.
How much longer? We're almost there.
Evie checked the reports from half a dozen of the other shuttles. Some had reached their destinations, but nothing had been found yet.
This may all turn out to be nothing.
As she stared at her console, one of the indicators lit up, and she glanced up, not sure what it was picking up.
What's up?
Wolf asked.
I don't know. I thought I had something, but I don't see it.
Wolf leaned around her.
Was it a malfunction? Sometimes the intense gravity of a place like this might cause false positives. That might have been it,
Evie replied. Though for a second she thought she caught something in the distance. She shook her head.
2 minutes until we reach the moons.
They were a curious phenomenon, like everything in the system. 2 moons. Each of them held the other in place as they orbited their own planet, which in turn was one of the 6 concentrated around the Class F white star in the system. And that star and its entire system of planets formed an even larger orbit around the 2 giants, which also had their own planetoids. It was one of the most complex and diverse planetary alignments Evie had ever seen, and it reminded her of an old nesting doll. There was always another layer to uncover. As they approached the 2 moons, Evie could barely believe her eyes, though all the indicators on her board were silent. They should be lighting up like crazy.
I can't believe it, she said, staring at the moons. It was like nothing she'd ever seen before. What?
Wolf looked out the window.
The arch. It's huge. It must be 100 kilometers tall,
Evie replied. Before her was what could only be described as an archway made of what looked to be stone, though she couldn't understand how stone blocks that large could ever have been carved. Each block was roughly the size of... There was no comparison. It was the largest structure she'd ever seen. The largest in existence, probably. And it was just sitting there, spanning the distance from one moon to the other. Because both were tidally locked, they didn't rotate themselves, only around their common point. And some civilization had carved massive enough stones to build an arch between them. It seemed to serve no purpose other than to act as a massive doorway.
It's impossible, Evie said. Have you ever seen anything like it? What would it take to build something like that?
Wolf stared out the window, then pulled back.
Sorry, Commander. What? The arch. Imagine the engineering know-how to design and build something like that. I'm sure you can appreciate it,
Evie replied. Cass was going to be so upset he'd miss this.
Commander? I don't see an arch. All I see is the 2 moons.
Evie whipped her head to her. She must be messing with her. Some kind of hazing for her new commander.
Come on, she smiled. This may be what we're looking for.
Evie turned back to the arch.
But I don't see any signs of inhabitants on either of the moons. And no ships patrolling the area. Someone was or is definitely here, though. Commander, Wolf said, her voice measured, there is no arch.
Okay, enough was enough. It was time to get serious. This could have something to do with the alien armada. They needed to get the other shuttles over here to start studying it immediately.
Funny, Evie tapped her comm. All units converge on my position. We found what seems to be a giant archway in space. We're going in for a closer look.
Wolf put her hand out, pointing to Evie's instrument board.
Commander, there's nothing out there. The sensors aren't picking up whatever you think you're seeing.
Evie furrowed her brow and glanced down.
That wasn't possible.
It was right there in front of them.
I've noticed you've been looking a bit tired lately, Wolf continued. I recognize that look, because I used to see it in the mirror after 16 hours of survey work. And trust me, the stims only make things worse.
Evie whipped her head to the engineer.
What are you talking about?
Wolf pursed her lips.
You probably haven't noticed yet, but you've got tiny blue lines across your irises. That's a result of taking too many stims. Keep going, and it'll only get worse.
Evie turned away from her, shutting her eyes for a moment, and mad she'd let herself react so easily to being called out.
Commander, can you verify? Did you say a giant archway?
Wilmoth said from the space wing right behind her.
Because I'm not seeing it.
She looked back up at the archway, taking up most of her view. Its height was immense. She wasn't tired or crazy or anything else. This thing was here, and she needed to prove it. Wolf touched her own personal comm.
Sorry, Captain, but I think we've had a false alarm. But, she said.
Evie glanced over while the engineer was distracted and entered her own code to lock out the computer. It cut Wolf off mid-sentence.
Commander, she asked, trepidation in her voice, what are you doing? Whether you can see it or not, that archway is real, and we're going to get a good, close look. If I have to do it myself. This could be the clue that leads us to the armada. Commander Wolf, can you say again? You cut out, Wilmoth said.
Other comm indicators were coming in from the other shuttles. Evie ignored them. She was obviously the only one who could see this thing. But they'd be singing a different tune when she landed on it.
I'm taking us in, she said. Just sit back. Taking us in where? Wolf asked. I want to get a sample from that archway. We're going to land on it and then get some physical samples. Commander, there is no archway, Wolf said, more forcefully this time. She stood. Please unlock the computer. This is dangerous.
Evie ignored her, pushing the throttle forward toward the archway.
Commander, what's going on? Wilmoth said through the comm. Is everything okay?
Evie would answer her once they'd landed. It should only take a few minutes.
We're coming within the gravitational pull of the moon.
Wolf glanced at the instrument panel.
If you cut the engines while we're dead in space, we'll come crashing down to the surface. Not if we're on the arch, Evie said.
It was massive enough, it probably generated its own small gravitational field. They'd be fine.
Damn it,
Wolf said, working on the controls and having no luck. She retreated to the back of the shuttle.
Just hang on a second, Evie said. You'll see when we land.
She heard Wolf messing around to the back, but she didn't pay her any attention. All her focus was on the archway looming over them like an ancient god, more massive than any artificial structure in the universe.
There, Wolf said. Mayday! Mayday! Anyone, please respond. We have an emergency on Calypso, and we're out of control.
Evie turned in her seat to see Wolf staring at her, but speaking into a small device she'd hooked into the shuttle's communication systems. The wireline led to the back of Wolf's hand, which was trickling blood.
Say again, Calypso?
This time it was Captain Green.
There's no problem, Captain, Evie replied. We're right where we should be. You need to tell the other shuttles to rendezvous with us here at the arch. There is no arch, Wolf yelled. She's going to end up killing us if someone doesn't get us some help, and right now."
Evie felt the ship jerk, and her instruments lit up with warnings. Wilmoth had hooked into them with one of her grapplers and pulled the shuttle away from the arch.
"No," she yelled. "This is what we're looking for. This is the alien structure."
She gunned the throttle, and the ship groaned against the strain of the two opposing forces. Wolf came up behind her and pulled her arms down, pinning her in the seat.
"I'm sorry, Commander, but you're not well," she said.
Evie struggled against the woman's grip, and even managed to find a small amount of leverage. Maybe she wasn't as out of shape as she thought. Wolf clamped down tighter, but fury and adrenaline surged through her veins, and Evie threw her off, regaining the controls and pushing the engines again toward the arch. No one was ever holding her down again. A second jolt knocked both her and Wolf forward, and Wolf's head hit the panel. She didn't yelp, only winced as she pulled it away, as blood ran down a thin line of her forehead. The glass panel was cracked, but Evie could still operate it, though now another Space Wing had joined Wilmoth in dragging her back.
"Damn it,"
she said, working the controls. She had to get to that arch, no matter what. She had to prove to everyone it was real. Pain exploded across her cheek, and Evie felt herself fall from the chair. But she never felt the ground.